Hello, I'm Lynne. I'm the Executive Director of the Victoria Law Foundation, and welcome to our In Conversation for 2023. It's a great pleasure to be spending time today with Victorian Ombudsman Deborah Glass, and I will introduce you to her properly in a minute or two. But first, we are proud to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise their abiding connection to this land, to its waterways and to community. The Victoria Law Foundation and indeed the Victorian Ombudsman are both on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and it's our privilege to pay respects to their elders and to all the generations of Wurundjeri who have cared for this land for the last 50,000 years and continue to do so. We believe that acknowledging the past is an essential step in building a more equitable future, and we recognise the impact of colonisation and the legacy of injustice and the marginalisation then and now of Wurundjeri and other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples. Victoria Law Foundation aims to break down the barriers to justice for all Victorians through our work in research, education and grants. Deborah Glass, OBE, is the Victorian Ombudsman, and this is a role that she has held for 9.5 of a 10-year non-renewable term. The Ombudsman is a really critical function in our democracy and in our system of justice, where all of us as Victorians can make complaints about government services and operations, and as a result it has an enormously broad brief. So determining what you investigate and how you go about that are very important decisions. As she prepares to hand the baton to her successor next March, now is the perfect opportunity to be in conversation with Deborah about the role and about her reflections on the last decade. Thank you so much for being with us.
My pleasure.
Now I want to take you back to the very beginning, briefly, just so we can set a bit of context. So you were raised in Victoria, you went to Monash University, but then you fled.
I did.
Fled the jurisdiction, you went to Asia and the UK.
Switzerland, Hong Kong, UK, yes.
Okay, in financial services and financial regulation.
Well, I started in banking. I mean, actually, I left on a one-way ticket thinking I was going to be a writer. You know, I was going to save the world, didn't know what I wanted to do, just knew I didn't want to be a lawyer. So it's all about, and I've often said, you know, when I've come back and I've talked to students, don't plan, because you never know where life is going to take you. I didn't plan. I certainly didn't plan to come back to Victoria 29 years later as the Ombudsman. But yes, I did spend many, many years, decades, in initially in banking, financial services, regulation, and in police complaints and corruption.
And we'll talk a little bit about your role at the Independent Police Complaints Commission in the UK, which is called the IPCC for short. It's a very prominent organisation at particularly critical moments. But I suppose taking all of that together, financial regulation and services, and then the police complaints activity, what kind of background do you think all of that gave you to take the reins as the Ombudsman?
I think I've always had a very well-developed sense of fairness. And if I look back at my career, actually I hate using that word, career, because I never thought of it as a career. I just did things that interested me. And there is a logic to it, but it's not a logic that I was aware of at the time. But I think that what they pretty much all have in common after I left the commercial world, which I did quite quickly, was the public interest. Right. Fundamentally, it's about the public interest, whether that's financial regulation, making sure the markets are honest, or dealing with police corruption in the United Kingdom. you're making decisions, you're doing things, you're investigating in the public interest.
The investigating bit strikes me as a common thread too. Is that a particular style of work that you enjoy, the investigatory process?
It is. I mean, there is something, particularly the kind of investigations you do in the role, where you really want to, you're searching for the truth.
Mm.
And often you know what happened. It's fairly obvious, when you're investigating, for example, a fatal shooting by a police officer in the United Kingdom. Somebody's died. They've been shot by a police officer. There isn't a question of who done it. Mm. What you're investigating is why. Mm. What were the circumstances? Was it proportionate? Was it reasonable? What happened? And that can be an enormously nuanced and complex story, much more complex than many of the investigations that might occur in a sort of standard police context, for example.
And you need to get it right. There's a lot riding on those investigations, as there are on your investigations in this role. But before we go to your return, I did want to pick up on the job with the IPCC, because you've spoken in the past about the Hillsborough tragedy, which was,
yes,
for those who are not familiar, a particularly hideous episode in a Yorkshire football stadium where 97 people died as a result of crush, followed rapidly by a litany of years and years and years of deceit and delay and I think as a result a failure of justice for the families and the other people involved. And your inquiry into that started in 2012 with the IPCC, and it was a monumental undertaking. So do you think that has had an impact on how you work and how you respond to investigations and particular circumstances for people?
I don't think you can deal with an investigation of the magnitude of Hillsborough without it affecting you and, in fact, changing you in multiple ways. I thought I was a pretty seasoned investigator before I set up that investigation, and I had dealt with many investigations. I dealt with grieving families. I thought I was a fairly experienced operator, and I think broadly I would have been. But nothing prepares you for something on that scale. And I think that there are many things that I've taken away from that and that have changed me from that. But I think that probably the most powerful is this extraordinary sense of justice that drove the families of the people who died, of the victims of the tragedy, the survivors of Hillsborough, drove them against all of the odds, the bureaucratic obstacles that were put in their way, the political sleights of hand, that came into play by successive governments, trying to come up with another way of sort of parking this story, this tragedy. But these families were not going to let this go.
And it was also fundamentally about accountability, wasn't it?
Well, it was this driving sense of justice that was burning in their bellies, that there had been no accountability, that there was this profound injustice that had been not only the appalling and tragic deaths of many young people, because these were people who were crushed. And it was the younger ones, the children, who died. But it was the what happened afterwards, where effectively the organs of the state put out a narrative that blamed them for their own deaths.
Yes, and there was some appalling media coverage that reinforced that, and I think re-traumatised over and over
Indeed.
again
Indeed.
The people involved. So I suppose if I were to take that all together, we have a commitment to the investigative process. We have a burning and lengthy commitment to fairness and to sheeting that home to accountability for those that may be required to finally take responsibility. So all of that sits in your career before you return.
Yes.
to take up
Yes.
the role here as the Ombudsman, which we should reiterate is an independent officer of the Victorian Parliament, established essentially to give voice to the citizens in their dealings with the state, fundamentally. So we'll come back to the dimensions of the investigative and accountability work in a few minutes. But do you remember your early impressions of Victoria and the office when you returned?
Well, I do recall a very stark gender impression when I came into the role, because I've spent many, many years, decades, as a woman in senior roles, particularly of late, and very unremarkable in the environments in which I moved, even though they were quite male environments, policing,
yeah.
Regulation, financial services and so on. And I never actually noticed this. But I found when I came into this role as the first woman to be the Victorian Ombudsman, that it was something of particular note, something that that it was an issue. It surprised me.
What about the office? What did you think of the Ombudsman's role and functions when you took the gig?
Well, I hadn't actually read the Ombudsman Act until I was appointed. So
it wasn't a prerequisite for the interview?
Well, I do recall being asked at the interview how I would exercise my powers. And I'm not sure I should make this confession quite so publicly, but I will. What the heck? At the time, I hadn't read the Ombudsman Act, and I actually had no idea what the Ombudsman's powers were. So I answered the question with one word. I said wisely.
I think brevity is always valuable.
I think that worked. But no, when I came into the role, then I realised the extent of the Ombudsman's powers, which I was quite pleased about, and I particularly loved the ability to make decisions in the interests of justice. It's spelt out in the Act that there are decisions, in the interests of justice, that I can express opinions that something appears to be contrary to law, and my absolute favourite is wrong.
Yes.
I can express an opinion that something is wrong and an action is wrong. And so I think that did surprise me when I came into the role, the extent of the Ombudsman's powers, and something that I've been very happy to use in the time I've been in the role.
And when I think about being able to declare something wrong, in a world in which, there is so much prevarication and disinformation about right and wrong and I think equivalence that goes on, that's a really powerful position to be able to take, isn't it?
Well, the Ombudsman operates very often in that space in which a decision may be lawful but isn't fair. So that's what we do. We deal in fairness here. And that doesn't mean we make decisions that support people who complain to us. Very often we have to take an unpopular stance and say, look, I'm sorry, I can see you're aggrieved. I can hear that you're very upset about what the council, what the agency has done to you, but actually they can do that. That's not unreasonable. But, taking a position in relation to fairness is not a popularity contest.
No. It's not. We'll come to some of those issues in a minute or two. But let's talk briefly about how you exercise those powers that you've described. In what ways you can investigate? What are the mechanisms for your investigations?
Well, to sum up a very lengthy act in a couple of sentences, there are the key functions of the office are clearly dealing with complaints from the public is an important one, about administrative actions of government agencies. So they could be your local council, a department, the prison system, it pretty much everything except the police and decisions of the courts is in my jurisdiction. So it's a very broad jurisdiction. So complaints, we get many tens of thousands every year.
Yep.
So I think that's the beating heart of what we do. But I don't need a complaint to be able to launch an investigation. I can also launch investigation on my own motion, as it's known. So that might start because we have a pattern of complaints. We got a lot of complaints about the registry of births, deaths and marriages, a few years back. And a particular era, we got a lot of complaints about workers' compensation claims agents. So sometimes that's a trigger for, do we need to look more deeply into this issue?
So that's about assessing the complaints that are coming in and thinking, okay, there's a trend here or there's an issue that requires a bit more.
That's one of the areas that we could look at. But I mean, there could be something in the media that raises concerns that we think, should we look a bit further at that one? So it's much more of an art than a science, deciding what to investigate. And it's important to stress that we have limited resources in this office, as with any integrity agency. You can never investigate all the things that interest you, so you have to use your resources proportionately. And that means making decisions about the public interest. There are things you have to do, the complaints you have to deal with, but there'll be a small number every year of areas of concern that you'll go, that's something we should be looking at.
So discretionary.
It is discretionary, but it will be very, very strongly influenced by the kinds of complaints and the trending, what we see coming through the door, what we see in the media, concerns that are expressed to us. We might, for example, get a community legal centre write to us about concerns they're seeing with fines. So then that will have a particular impact. So there are some of my own motion investigations have been started as a result of submissions sent to us, Tenants Victoria, about public housing maintenance debts.
Yes.
That sort of thing.
You also are subject at times to referrals from Parliament.
Yes, now that's an interesting part of my jurisdiction because it exists in my act, but it was used, I think, 3 times in the 40 years before I came into the role, and there have been 5 referrals from Parliament in the 9.5 years I've been doing the job. So it's not a high number, but inevitably they're the ones that attract headlines and almost invariably are controversial.
Right, so the frequency of those referrals has ramped up in recent times.
Well, really since the Red Shirts referral in 2015, it's I think steady stream is probably the wrong word for such a small number, but certainly there have been a succession of them in my term.
Yes, indeed.
That have, I think, provided a particular dimension on the role and on holding government to account that possibly doesn't exist in ombudsman work elsewhere.
Just before we move to the detail of the work, sketch, if you would, the integrity landscape, if you like, in Victoria. IBAC is a recent phenomenon compared to the Victorian Ombudsman. And now there is a shared responsibility in some aspects of your work between the VO and IBAC. And so how does that interrelationship work?
Well, there is, if I can sketch it very briefly, there is a complaints landscape that the Ombudsman is part of and an integrity landscape, and they're not exactly the same.
Yes.
So in dealing with complaints, we may be dealing with we're dealing with government agencies generally, but in dealing with the integrity landscape, we're generally dealing with corruption and its various forms and its sub-forms that fall short of criminal offences that we call maladministration in the Ombudsman world. And with those, IBAC is the clearinghouse for determining what isn't a protected disclosure, a whistleblower case.
Yep.
If it doesn't meet their threshold, which is relatively high, they may well refer it to my office. So we deal with the kind of small c corruption, or what IBAC is referred to as grey corruption, that falls short of criminal. And sometimes it's very difficult to tell where that border lies. So the relationship between my office and IBAC is a close one, and it does consist of us sending things to each other on a pretty regular basis.
And the other thing I just wanted to have you describe is the connection with human rights in particular and the Charter, because you have a very particular function in that regard.
I do, and that goes back to the introduction of the Charter in 2006. The Ombudsman is Victoria's human rights investigator. So I investigate breaches of the Charter, in effect, insofar as they relate to administrative decisions made by government agencies. So that is something that is implicit. We don't see it as a kind of a separate piece of work. Every time we get a complaint, any one of those 20,000 complaints could raise a human rights issue.
Yes.
So I think what is important about human rights and looking at human rights is mainstreaming that work. Not seeing it as a kind of add-on. Oh, there's a human rights complaint.
True.
Actually, many complaints are human rights complaints.
Indeed, and have profound human impact. But the way in which the Ombudsman's office is understood in the legal landscape is interesting. You deal with, as you've said, tens of thousands of complaints each year, most of which would be about administrative law.
Well, there's certainly administrative decisions.
Yes, okay. But do you see yourself as part of the legal sector?
Well, I didn't when I started in the job, and I did find it sort of rather amusing that the legal profession saw me as one of them, and I thought, I thought I left there 30 years ago, but here I am, embraced by the lawyers of Victoria, in a manner of speaking.
Some of them.
But that was at first, But I think broadly I regard this office as part of the justice landscape. So I think we're part of that wider justice system. We talk about access to justice. It's so important. Mm-hmm. And you can go to the courts, you can go to tribunals, you can come to the Ombudsman. And sometimes the Ombudsman is a much better bet for you.
Indeed.
Because for one thing, it's free. And it's not bound by precedent and many of the strictures that apply, quite rightly to our broader legal system.
Yes, and it's generally much more timely. So yes, we've done some work on that at the VLF, and how effective ombudsman's offices can be at resolving what otherwise would be really protracted disputes for people. Let's look at the kinds of investigations that you've undertaken over your tenure. As you've described, government departments are very often the subject of high numbers of complaints: corrections, housing, education, transport. Is there a department that you haven't touched?
Probably, but with 1,000 agencies in jurisdiction, I'm sure there are many.
Yes.
But that may well say as much about people's knowledge about complaining to the Ombudsman as about whether the decision-making of that particular agency. Prisons, for example, have been pretty much for the whole time I've been in the role, the number one complained about agency.
Yes, which is a surprise, I think, to many, until you understand.
There is a free call line to the Ombudsman's office in every Victorian prison, so prisoners know they can complain to the Ombudsman, and it's easy to complain. If a similar level of awareness existed throughout Victoria about their local council, for example, I'm pretty sure that local councils would overtake prisons. And you can complain about your local council, but not everybody knows that they can do that.
And that's a matter that you've spent significant time and resources to improve the awareness of the role of the Ombudsman and people's opportunity to make complaints.
Well, time, not enough resources. I mean, the resources have either not been there, or we've run up against COVID for 2 years, which makes it much harder to get out and promote a message. It's something that I've been aware of since I came into the role, was that the kind of people who need your services the most are usually the ones who are least likely to have heard of you. And I'm afraid that remains the case today. So yes, we have done outreach. We continue to do that. We've had some successes. It's a work in progress. It really is. And I will leave to the next Ombudsman an unfinished task.
Always, I think, unfinished for all of us who work in that sphere. I want to pick up on the two areas that you described as being your frequent flyers, so prisons and local government. And I recall the work that you did around rehabilitation and reintegration of prisoners, which ended up being a systemic investigation of the way in which people were offered rehabilitative support inside prison and what happened to them when they were released. So that grew, it seemed to me, from probably a fairly narrow scope initially into a much broader investigation. So what happens there? When do you decide, okay, we were initially looking at this, but now I think we'll open it up?
Yes, well, absolutely right. I mean, I thought, when I decided to do an own motion investigation to rehabilitation of prisoners, that I'd be looking at programs in prisons, which would have been a very narrow piece of work. But what happened in that case, and happens occasionally in my own motion investigations, you're informed by submissions. People tell you what they think. And we got some really powerful submissions, many from the legal community, people who are working in the justice community, people who were working in prisons, who made some really important points about widening that out.
Right.
And they were right. So that report looked much more holistically at the causes of why people are in prison in the first place. And but I have to say, and that's been a theme, throughout my term. I've started out looking at rehabilitation prisons. That's gone on to a lot of other prisons work, including work we've done in connection with OPCAT, the United Nations Treaty. So it's been a constant theme in my term. I would have to say it's probably been the most frustrating theme. It's an area where I probably had the least traction in terms of recommendations.
In terms of getting
change. In terms of action, yeah. I'm really proud of the response we get to the vast majority of the work we do. And I mean, let me give you another example, if I may. One of some of the COVID investigations I carried out had significant impact, and one of them was into the grant scheme.
Which was a small business grant.
Small business grants, which was a great idea, really important. Good on the government for introducing this lifeline for small businesses. It was implemented incredibly quickly, far too quickly, without any kind of complaint system, without any kind of fail-safe mechanisms, and very quickly we started getting complaints, and they got into the hundreds and indeed into well over 1,000, and what came through in those complaints was, despite this being a very good idea, it was being implemented with a bureaucratic mindset that undermined the whole purpose of it. So, for example, somebody who had a legitimate, reason to expect a grant was being denied the grants because they had made a typo in an application form. They didn't use online forms properly. They'd made a simple mistake and were then told, sorry,
computer
no grant.
says no.
Computer says no, exactly. So That's one that I'm particularly proud of, because the impact of that, and all credit to the department, they recognised during the investigation that they were being overly restrictive, and they agreed to change their approach. And again, this is where you can make a real difference to public administration. So, and what you want to do is take people with you and get them to say, oh yeah, that was not a good way to conduct that grants program. Actually, we needed to be more compassionate, more humane. We needed to take into account individual circumstances. And the result of that investigation in sort of raw numbers was $42 million in grants to small businesses that they would not otherwise have received, that they were entitled to.
Let's talk briefly about another of your COVID investigations. I mean, there were a number, but the lockdowns of the towers, which prompted all sorts of response of various kinds. But what was the genesis of that? How did you come to do that investigation? And how difficult was it to do it during lockdown?
It was very challenging. I remember, and I suspect anybody listening to this remembers, the images on our television screens when the public housing towers were locked down.
Yep.
Police surrounding the towers, people at the windows.
Bewildered.
Yeah, what's happened? So so first of all, I saw those images, began asking questions. We began getting complaints. We had a very useful connection with one of the local community legal centres who was working on the ground, and they were talking to us about what people were saying to them. So it was a very quick decision. And I remember actually saying, and two of my investigators actually were there nearby and got a sense for themselves about what was happening. So it was one of those times where you say, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this. I've got to do this now and quickly. This cannot take a year. So if I'm going to investigate the lockdown of the public housing towers, we are going to need to
rally the troops.
And come up with a way of doing this when the whole of the state is in deep lockdown. So that's what we did. So that was challenging. There were a huge number of Zoom interviews. We engaged with complainants on Zoom. We interviewed decision makers similarly as part of the investigation to try to understand what happened, who made the decision, where did it come from, what were the consequences. So it was enormously challenging. I'm very proud of the fact that we were able to table that report within 6 months of the lockdown, and it had an impact. The apology, my recommendation for an apology to the residents remains one of the very small number of Ombudsman recommendations that the government did not accept. But sometimes actions speak louder than words, and I did notice that when there was a similar breakout of COVID in the towers, almost exactly a year later, the response on the ground was very, very different.
Yes, I think many of us recognised that shift, which was entirely appropriate and probably would not have happened had it not been for your close scrutiny. The other area which I'm interested in, because it has such breadth, is local government. You have produced a significant number of reports on local government's specific and general. But I think one of the themes that runs through your work is both this opportunity to, for want of a better phrase, name and shame, but also to encourage better behaviour, as you've described from departments, but also in local government. And you've done a huge amount of work to try and support them to handle complaints better and to actually recognise when they have a complaint, which is bizarrely something that local government can be a bit ambiguous or ambivalent about. But do you think local government is getting any better? I mean, the issues there are legion, but very clear themes: nepotism, conflicts of interest, and maladministration. So are you seeing improvement over the decade?
In some areas, definitely. I mean, in complaint handling, and you're right, we've done a lot of work working with councils, putting out guides on how to do a better job of dealing with complaints. And the other thing that we've actually done quite recently, and this is relatively new for the Ombudsman, is conciliation. So we now have a conciliation function, which has been particularly good with local councils and public housing, and there are some areas where it's been very successful. Conciliation is a particularly useful technique when there is an ongoing relationship between somebody, a complainant, and their counsel, for example. And there's been a series of long, intractable problems that have caused endless complaints over a long period. Now, this is all voluntary. People don't have to sign up for it. But because we've been having some really good successes with conciliation, increasingly local councils have become aware of that and are putting their hands up to say, hey, we've got this long-running problem with this complaint. Let's give it a go. What's to lose? So that's been a really a good development, I think, for the office, and increasingly we are seeing councils and other agencies who have long relationships with people who can be challenging. That's actually been I think, quite a success story.
Local government is in all of our lives, and it touches very basic functions, rates and roads and rubbish. And I suppose that's why it generates so many complaints. And I think what that illustrates is how systemic and high level your investigations can be, but also how grassroots, because you're dealing with those sorts of everyday issues that can make people's lives really difficult and need some kind of pressure valve release, which is what making a complaint can sometimes offer. So if it comes to how and you talked a wee bit about this earlier, about determining the priorities and the distribution of your limited resources, how do you make calls about the tens of thousands of complaints you have as opposed to own motion decisions? Or how do you prioritize in your own mind and for your office where the effort is put?
Well, if it's a complaint, we deal with every complaint we get on their merits. Some complaints can be resolved with a phone call, and if that can happen, we'll do that. Some complaints on their face, we'll never be able to help that person.
And what do you do in that instance?
Well, we tell them that, because there's no point in if there is no realistic outcome that we can achieve for someone, then it's much better to close that down than have that occupy a lot of your resource to no avail. And sometimes that is about encouraging your staff to make they have delegated authority to make those difficult decisions. But when it comes to deciding on the systemic themes, then that will be driven by many, many factors, and essentially the public interest. But it will also be looking, who else is out there. So if the Auditor General is looking at that area, or IBAC's looking at that area, we'll leave that to them. There are other issues here for us to look at. But I think one of the things that distinguishes the Ombudsman from many of the other integrity agencies in the landscape is that our work is very much about people as opposed to systems and processes. It is the people at the heart of a complaint, the people who are affected by an action. That's what we're looking at here.
Yeah. Let's look back over the last 10 years. I mean, as you've described, there have been some controversial reports. There have been those that have hit the headlines in very powerful ways. I'm thinking particularly of the Towers lockdown, but also the Red Shirts investigation, your joint investigation with IBAC around Operation Watts. And I think you have another paper to come, which was, I think, also a parliamentary referral around politicisation of the public sector. So when these investigations cross with the government's interest, is that when things get hot?
Things will always get hot on for whatever reasons. But one of the important things for me is to really to rise above that and do the right thing, whether it's popular with the government, with anyone. So it's and I think that's a really important mantra to keep hold of when you're the Ombudsman. This is not a popularity contest. So I didn't ask for the Red Shirts referral. I didn't ask for any of these referrals from Parliament. They come to me. I deal with them on their merits. I investigate them on their merits. And I put out a report that is evidence-based. And if people question that, I say, read the report. The decisions I come to, the outcomes are based on the evidence. And that's how it must be.
It's not for the faint-hearted, though.
No, but you wouldn't want your ombudsman to be faint-hearted.
So looking back over the decade, can you see how your understanding of the role and the role itself have evolved over that period? I mean, you did mention earlier that you came to an understanding of your embrace from by the legal fraternity. What other recognitions, I suppose, have you had over that time that you might reflect on now?
Some things change, but some things remain the same. And when I started in the role, I had a vision of fairness, social justice, integrity, independence, accountability. And that hasn't changed. Those things are as important today as they were then. If anything, they're even more so. So I think the role of the office is incredibly important. I think it's important as the occupant that you be above the political fray. There's no doubt that that people will try and draw you in, and they will attempt to politicise the role. As I say, none of those referrals from Parliament, which many of them have strong political overtones, were things that I chose to take on. They were sent to me. I must investigate them. And what I hope is that anybody looking at my work would judge it on its merits.
Are there people or ideas or ways of seeing our society that have supported you in holding fast to those principles? Is there anyone you read or think of, inspirations?
My parents, who sadly neither of them here to hear me extol their virtues, but my parents were very influential, very strong in their different ways. My father was around for much of my term as ombudsman and would come along to all of my public speeches. But yes, I think the grounding of my values, which comes from my parents, my community, my family, is what keeps you grounded in the role. Because you can be buffeted by attacks, it can be very unfair, you can be criticised for all kinds of things that you didn't do. It is not a job for the faint-hearted, absolutely. But so you need to be anchored. So I think I've been anchored by those values and by the people around me, who have helped me to remain anchored and remain in place despite the winds, the turmoil that so often goes with the role.
There must have been times, though, when you would read press or hear commentary and think, God, I really wish I could respond. Have there?
Well, if I can, I do. So it's I'm a great believer in telling it like it is. I mean, the job is speaking truth to power, and subject to the constraints in my legislation, of which there are still a few, I will play a completely straight bat in dealing with such things as misinformation and mischief, because inevitably you find that in a role like this.
I'm going to put this in two ways, and you can answer it any way you like. What advice would you give to the young Deborah of 10 years ago from your vantage point now, or what would you offer to your successor as sound advice for the next phase?
Well, to your first question, I don't think there is anything I would have done differently. Nothing material that I would have done differently. You can't plan these things, and I didn't plan any of the matters that came towards me. But I think that remaining grounded has helped, and I think the office does have a genuine reputation for independent investigation that is evidence-based, that is real, that is not
speculative.
It's not speculative, and it's not unfair. This is we do tell it like it is, and it is nuanced. And I think so much of this, so much of what we see, so much of the argument in the world out there lacks nuance. Things are black and white and polarized. My world is full of nuance. My reports are full of nuance, and that's something that is not easy to communicate in a black and white world. But I'm going to stick to it because these things are nuanced. Advice I would give to the next ombudsman: you're going to be inheriting a fabulous team. Keep them.
Hang on.
Yeah. Hold to the values that make people want to work in this office.
And what happens to you next, Deborah Glass?
I think when you take on a role like ombudsman, it's got to be your last big job. Because if you do it properly, you're not going to get another one. Well, not from the government, anyway. And also, what would you go on to do? When you've been ombudsman, I think I have the best job in the state. So the garden's looking promising. Don't know, but I've still got a little bit more to do before I will turn my mind more fully to that one.
Well, it's been an enormous privilege spending time with you. Thank you very much indeed for being part of our In Conversation for 2023. And go well, whatever comes next.
Thank you. My pleasure.